High in the heart of the Andes Mountains, in the year 1972, a chartered flight carrying a rugby team and their companions vanished into the frozen silence of the peaks. What began as a journey of friendship and sport became one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever told. A tale of endurance, loss, hope, and the strength of the human spirit when tested beyond imagination. Over the next 2.5 months, the survivors faced hunger, avalanches, despair, and impossible choices. Yet against the vast indifference of the mountains, they held on. Their story is not only about tragedy, but about courage, resilience, and the fragile light of hope that refuses to be extinguished. If you enjoy listening to these immersive histories, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support helps us continue creating these stories, and it means so much to know you're part of this journey with us. Now, find a comfortable place. Allow your breathing to slow. Let the noise of the day drift away. And as you sit back and relax, join me as we step into the frozen silence of the Andes, where survival itself became a story for the ages. Part 1. A Skyward Journey. The year was 1972, and spring had only just begun to soften the air in Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. Along the streets that led down to the harbor, jacaranda trees were still holding onto their purple blossoms. Students walked in clusters through the avenues, their voices carrying the easy laughter of youth. For the young men of the Old Christians Rugby Club, the season had been one of energy and promise. They were not professionals, not hardened athletes under contract or fame, but university students who found in rugby a way to test their strength, to build camaraderie, and to carry a flag of identity beyond the borders of their small nation. The invitation to play a friendly match in Santiago, Chile, was more than just sport. It was a chance to fly over the Andes, those jagged, snow-bitten mountains that stretched like a spine down the continent of South America. It was a chance for adventure, for a story to tell in later years when life had become steady and predictable. And so, as the date of departure drew near, the players gathered with excitement, their luggage packed not only with boots and jerseys, but with anticipation. Among them were brothers, cousins, lifelong friends. Some had grown up in neighboring houses, their lives braided together through childhood games, school, and now the pitch. Others had only recently joined the circle, but the sense of belonging was strong. Families gathered to see them off, parents and siblings sharing embraces that were meant to be casual, yet carried the unspoken weight of worry that comes whenever a loved one boards an aircraft. The plane waiting at Carrasco International Airport was not a gleaming airliner with rows upon rows of strangers. It was a Fairchild FH-227, a twin-engine turboprop operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. Its cabin was smaller, its seats filled almost entirely by the team, their coaches, and a handful of relatives and supporters. The aircraft had been chartered for this very trip, and in that intimacy lay a sense of comfort. To the passengers, it felt less like stepping into a machine of metal and fuel, and more like entering a bus in the sky that would carry them together, all at once, across the roof of the continent. As the engines rumbled to life, conversation flowed easily. Cards were dealt at the back. Someone pulled out a guitar, its strings carrying fragments of song that mingled with the vibration of the fuselage. From the windows, Montevideo shrank away, the green fields and the silver line of the Rio de la Plata falling into distance. Soon the coast gave way to rolling land, and then to the vast sweep of the Pampas, where ranches stretched endlessly beneath a sky of high, drifting clouds. The rugby players were restless in their seats, their knees bumping against the backs before them. Youth and energy have little patience for stillness. Jokes moved down the aisle, each punchline met with laughter that seemed too loud for the small cabin. There was no sense of foreboding, only eagerness. The Andes were ahead, and while their reputation was fierce, mountains of dizzying height, capped in snow year-round, they were also a source of fascination. The thought of flying directly over such a barrier was thrilling in itself. The Fairchild was no stranger to these skies. The pilots at the controls were experienced in military flights, accustomed to navigation across difficult terrain. Yet the Andes, stretching from Colombia in the north to Patagonia in the south, were unlike any other mountain chain. They rose not gently, but with violence, jagged and abrupt, their ridges like knives slicing into the heavens. The peaks between Chile and Argentina were some of the highest outside of the Himalayas. And within their valleys, weather brewed with sudden fury, storms conjured in minutes from seemingly clear skies. Still, for now, the flight was calm. As afternoon stretched on, the sun angled westward, gilding the edges of clouds. From the small windows, passengers looked down on landscapes that seemed endless, fields of gold and brown stitched with rivers. It was easy to believe that the journey would remain simple, that in a few hours they would be descending towards Santiago, where friends and rivals alike awaited the match. Not all aboard were players. Among the passengers were women, sisters, girlfriends, supporters who had chosen to join the adventure. They too shared in the laughter, though some leaned their foreheads to the cool glass of the windows, tracing the rivers and roads far below. The cabin was a patchwork of chatter, of card games, of half-sung songs, of the occasional shout that broke into applause when someone dealt a winning hand. The hours passed, and with them came a change in the air. The Fairchild stopped for refueling in Mendoza, Argentina, at the very edge of the mountains. Here the passengers stretched their legs, looked at the looming peaks with a mixture of awe and unease, and reboarded. The mood was lighter than the weather, which had begun to shift. Clouds gathered above the summits, dragging their shadows across the white slopes. For the pilots, this meant challenge. For the passengers, it meant little more than spectacle. They trusted in the cockpit, in the weight of routine, in the simple fact that planes flew this route every day. As the aircraft lifted again, it began the climb into the Andes. Below, the flat lands gave way to rising hills, then to mountains that swelled against the sky. From the windows, the world looked transformed, no longer familiar, no longer green and brown, but white and jagged, as though the earth had been split open and frozen in mid-motion. Passengers pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at the sight. The Andes were not merely high, they were colossal. Peaks thrust upward like the bones of a sleeping giant, glaciers spilling down their flanks like rivers of glass. Inside the cabin, conversation grew softer. The sheer magnitude of the landscape seemed to hush the voices. A few still joked, still shuffled cards, but many simply looked outward, their breath fogging the windows as they stared at the endless ridges. To see such immensity was to feel one's own smallness. The Fairchild rattled in turbulence, its frame shivering under invisible hands of wind. The guitar was stilled, the cards lowered. Yet no one panicked. Turbulence was part of flying, an annoyance, nothing more. The plane steadied again, and the noise of the engines filled the silence. What the passengers could not know was that the weather ahead was worsening. Clouds thickened, hiding the peaks in swirls of grey. Snowstorms, sudden and sharp, are not uncommon in the high Andes even in spring. Navigation in such conditions demanded precision, for valleys looked alike, and a single miscalculation could bring an aircraft too close to rock and ice. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged clipped words, eyes on their instruments, ears straining for radio signals that wavered in the storm. In the cabin, however, the mood remained calm. The players leaned against one another, trading stories of matches past. Some dozed, their heads rolling gently with the motion of the aircraft. A few wrote notes to loved ones, scrawling quick lines on scraps of paper, intending to hand them over on their return. None of these words carried urgency. They were tokens of affection, casual promises of reunion. The light outside dimmed as the plane pushed deeper into the weather. Windows that had shown vistas of white peaks now showed only mist and shadow. The engines droned louder, as if straining against the storm. Still, within the fuselage, there was no alarm. The passengers trusted, as passengers always do, that those at the controls knew the way forward. It was a trust born of routine, of all the times that journeys had ended safely, of all the flights that had crossed these same skies without incident. But the Andes were no ordinary mountains. They were older than memory, taller than imagination, and their silence had swallowed countless travelers through centuries past. The passengers of the Fairchild could not yet sense it, but they were entering a world that would soon test them beyond anything they had ever known. And so part one closes in a hush, a plane climbing into cloud, its cabin full of youth and laughter, its wings beating against winds that gathered unseen. For now, the story holds them in suspension, not yet broken, not yet lost, but carried upward into the frozen silence that waits ahead. Part 2. Into the Mountains. The sound began as a low shudder, a vibration that ran through the cabin floor and into the passengers' shoes. At first it was little more than turbulence, the sort of jolt that reminded everyone that outside their small pressurized world lay the raw power of air currents and mountain winds. The young men laughed nervously, gripping their armrests, leaning into the familiar ritual of pretending that such things did not trouble them. But the shudder grew heavier, the rattling sharper, until the plane itself seemed to groan under the strain of the storm. From the windows there was no longer any horizon, only a white blindness, clouds so dense that sky and snow became indistinguishable. For the pilots, this was the most dangerous kind of flying. Without visual landmarks, they relied on instruments alone, gauges that told of altitude, direction, and rate of descent. Yet the Andes were unforgiving. Valleys looked alike, ridges blended together, and even a small misreading could mean the difference between safe passage and catastrophe. In the cabin, passengers shifted uneasily. The cards had been packed away, the guitar silenced. The engine's steady drone was no longer a background hum but a lifeline, the one sound that promised motion forward. Some prayed quietly, words whispered against the roar. Others squeezed the hands of those beside them, cousins pressing fingers to brothers, friends to friends, seeking reassurance in touch. Then came the jolt. A violent lurch threw passengers against their seat belts, overhead compartments rattling as luggage fell. Someone screamed. The plane dropped suddenly, as though the air had been yanked out from under it. Gravity seemed to vanish for a moment, bodies lifting before crashing back into seats. The pilots fought with the controls, their voices clipped, urgent. The storm had hidden the mountains until they were already upon them. A ridge rose directly in their path, its face a wall of rock and ice. Engines strained, but the Fairchild was not built for sudden climbs at such altitude. The fuselage shuddered as the wings clipped the slope, tearing through snow, striking stone. In that moment, sound became everything. Metal screeched as if alive, glass shattered into glittering fragments, bodies were flung forward with crushing force. The cabin erupted in chaos, the cry of twisting steel, the dull thunder of impact, the unison of human voices raised in terror. The tail snapped away. Seats were ripped from their moorings. Snow poured into the ruptured hull as the fuselage broke and tumbled down a slope. For a few terrible seconds, the plane became less a machine than a sled, sliding uncontrollably through snowfields, crashing over ridges, finally grinding to a halt in a cloud of ice and silence. And then, stillness. At first there was only ringing in the ears, the kind that follows an explosion. Passengers blinked, dazed, their senses struggling to reassemble the world. The cabin was torn open, light and snow spilling inside. Some cried out for loved ones, their voices raw. Others sat frozen, unable to move, unable to believe that the motion had stopped. Death had come swiftly to some. The impact had claimed lives at the front and rear, where the force had been greatest. Others were gravely injured, pinned beneath twisted metal or broken seats. Blood mingled with snow, staining it dark. The living staggered to their feet, dazed, faces pale against the white. The cold bit instantly, a fierce reminder that they were not only broken but stranded, surrounded by an endless wilderness of ice and stone. The survivors pulled themselves together with instinct rather than plan. They tore at the wreckage, freeing those they could reach, dragging the injured to what remained of the fuselage. Snow blinded their eyes, their breath rising in sharp clouds. Each movement was clumsy in the thin air, each step sinking deep. Yet they worked, because to do nothing was unthinkable. Inside the broken fuselage, they made order where there was none. The injured were laid across seats or the floor, blankets pulled from luggage to cover shivering bodies. A few with medical training, no more than students, but willing, began tending wounds with makeshift supplies. Clothing was torn into bandages, alcohol from bottles poured over gashes. There was no equipment, no professional hand, only determination and the raw will to keep breathing. As daylight waned, the magnitude of their isolation pressed upon them. The Andes stretched in all directions, a kingdom of snow and silence. There were no villages in sight, no roads, no lights. Only peaks, sharp against the dimming sky, and valleys buried in shadows. Rescue might come, surely, someone would search, but when, and how, was unknowable. The survivors gathered what they could from the wreckage, luggage thrown across the snow, scattered supplies. They salvaged chocolate, wine, a few bottles of soda. Hardly enough for a day, let alone for the unknown stretch ahead. Still, each item was a treasure, a small defiance against despair. Night descended with brutal speed. The temperature plummeted, dropping below freezing. The wind swept across the slopes, howling through the torn fuselage like a living thing. The survivors huddled together, bodies pressed close, sharing warmth. Breath misted in the air, condensation freezing against metal walls. Darkness pressed in, vast and unbroken. Above, the stars blazed with merciless clarity, their cold fire indifferent to human suffering. It was in that first night that the survivors truly understood the scale of what had happened. The crash had not been an interruption of life, something to be quickly corrected by authorities arriving with blankets and stretchers. It was a severing, a casting out into a world where only their own choices, their own endurance, could mean the difference between survival and death. Some prayed aloud, voices steady despite exhaustion. Others lay in silence, staring upward through the torn roof at the impossible sweep of the Milky Way. The mountains had no pity. They loomed as guardians, walls of ice that separated them from the world they once knew. The young men of the rugby club, who only hours before had laughed over cards and songs, now felt the weight of fragility. They were not invincible, not protected by the routines of modern life. They were, instead, like the countless travelers of centuries past who had faced the Andes and found in them both beauty and terror. In the quiet between gusts of wind, the survivors whispered to one another. They spoke of families, of Montevideo, of the rugby match that now seemed impossibly distant. They clung to memories, to names, to anything that tied them to life beyond the snow. Yet beneath those words lay fear, deep and unspoken. Would anyone come? Could anyone even find them, lost in this endless sea of peaks? Sleep came fitfully, in snatches broken by shivering. The fuselage groaned in the wind, its torn edges creaking like a ship adrift. Some dreamed of warmth, of summer beaches, of loved ones waiting at home. Others dreamed of falling endlessly through clouds, the crash replaying again and again. By dawn, exhaustion had dulled the sharp edge of terror. The survivors awoke to a world of white, the sun blazing off snow so bright it burned their eyes. The mountains towered around them, cliffs and ridges rising like walls. The fuselage lay tilted in a shallow valley, half buried, its broken tail pointing uselessly toward the sky. They counted their numbers. They counted their dead. And in that tally lay both despair and resolve. Despair at those who would never rise again, resolve to fight for those who still breathed. The Andes had claimed their first toll, but the living would not yet surrender. The crash had cast them into another existence, one stripped of comfort and certainty. Yet in that stripped-down world, clarity emerged. To survive, they would need to rely on one another, to endure cold and hunger, to face choices they could not yet imagine. The mountains did not speak. They offered no welcome, no promise, only silence, frozen and eternal. And within that silence, 45 souls had been scattered, some extinguished, others flickering, each clinging to the fragile flame of life. This was only the beginning. Part 3. The Cold Embrace. The dawn after the crash came with a light so sharp it cut at the eyes. The Andes are deceptive in that way. The night is a depthless pit of freezing darkness, but when the sun rises it does so without mercy. The snow that blankets every slope reflects the light back with blinding intensity, turning the mountains into an endless sea of white fire. The survivors, blinking awake inside the battered fuselage, shielded their eyes with hands and scraps of cloth, already learning that even vision itself would become a battle here. The air inside the wreck was frigid, though marginally less brutal than the open slopes. Every breath condensed into pale mist, every surface was rimed with frost. The fuselage had become their only refuge, a hollow shell of aluminum and torn seats, with jagged edges that let the wind moan through. It was no home, but it was all they had. In those first moments of day, clarity returned. The shock that had muffled minds during the crash and the night began to lift, replaced with grim understanding. They were alive, yes, but alive in a place that seemed designed to extinguish life. Towering walls of rock hemmed them in, snowdrifts stretched endlessly, and the nearest sign of human presence was far beyond imagination. The roll call was somber. Names were spoken aloud, each answered with a weak "here" or with silence. The silence weighed heavier. They counted the living, then the dead. Bodies lay in the snow outside the fuselage, frozen in the positions in which death had caught them. Others still groaned within, clinging to breath despite broken limbs and crushing injuries. Grief had no time to take its full shape. There was too much to do, and too little energy with which to do it. The injured required immediate care. Those with knowledge, a medical student, a few others who had studied basic first aid, became doctors by necessity. Splints were fashioned from seat frames, bandages torn from clothing. The wounded moaned as their limbs were set, as wounds were cleaned with brandy poured from shattered bottles. Each gesture of care was clumsy, but it was done with devotion. They were not strangers here. They were friends, teammates, brothers, and every life saved was a small act of defiance against the immensity of death that surrounded them. Food was the next concern. They searched the wreckage with frantic energy, gathering what little could be found. From luggage they pulled chocolate bars, a few bottles of soda, a tin of mussels, some candies. The entire hoard could fit into a small pile on the snow. Even at first glance, they knew it would not last. 40 survivors, and barely enough food for a single meal. They agreed, almost without words, to ration. A square of chocolate, a sip of wine, half a candy. Each portion so small it seemed laughable, yet when placed on the tongue it became sacred. They chewed slowly, letting sweetness dissolve, pretending for a few seconds that they were nourished. Hunger, at first a growl in the stomach, soon became an ache in the bones, a constant reminder that survival would not be easy. Water was easier to find, though cruel in its form. Snow was everywhere, pure and clean, but to eat it raw only brought more cold into the body. So they filled bottles and cans, holding them against their skin until the warmth of living flesh melted the ice. Each sip was precious, more satisfying than any drink ever poured at a table. The act of drinking became ritual, a reminder that, however thin the line, life still held. As hours stretched into days, the mountains revealed themselves not as silent witnesses but as relentless adversaries. The cold was unbroken, even when the sun stood high. At night, temperatures plunged so low that breath froze in the air, crusting against mustaches and eyebrows. The survivors huddled together, pressed side by side in rows upon the floor of the fuselage, bodies serving as blankets for one another. Dignity was forgotten. Survival demanded closeness, the sharing of warmth in whatever form it could be given. Sleep was shallow, broken by shivers and the endless keening of wind. Dreams, when they came, were cruel, feasts of bread and fruit, visions of home kitchens, the warmth of beds left behind. Waking was no comfort. The dreams dissolved, and the cold returned, a constant companion. They began to organize themselves, for chaos was a luxury they could not afford. The fuselage became divided by necessity, a place for the injured, a place for supplies, a place for the living to huddle. Tasks were assigned. Some cared for the wounded, checking bandages, offering water. Others ventured outside to collect luggage scattered across the slopes, dragging it back through knee-deep snow. Each suitcase, each bundle, was opened with trembling hands, in hope of finding food. Too often, only clothes and papers emerged, tokens of lives that now felt impossibly far away. Yet clothes, too, were treasures. Every extra shirt, every pair of socks was layered upon shivering bodies. Fashion disappeared, replaced by absurd combinations, dresses over trousers, coats cut open and wrapped as blankets. They wrapped their feet in rags, anything to dull the sting of frost. The mountains pressed down with silence so heavy it seemed to have a sound of its own. There were no birds, no rustle of trees, no distant hum of villages. Only the wind, the groan of shifting ice, and the murmurs of the survivors. Time itself blurred. Days and nights blended, distinguished only by light and dark. Hunger gnawed without rest, cold bit without mercy. Hope, however, still flickered. On the first days after the crash, many were certain that rescue would come quickly. Planes flew overhead from time to time, tiny specks against the blue. At the sound of engines, survivors rushed from the fuselage, waving fabric, mirrors, anything that might catch the sun. Their voices rang out in hoarse shouts, calling to skies that did not answer. The planes passed on, disappearing into distance. Each failure struck like a blow. How could they not be seen? The fuselage was white against snow, small, almost invisible in the immensity of the mountains. To the eyes of pilots searching miles of peaks and valleys, it was no more than a speck lost in a canvas of white. The survivors returned inside each time, hearts heavier, the cold biting more deeply into their faith. Hunger became sharper with each passing day. The meager supply of food dwindled, each ration smaller than the last. They stretched the chocolate until a square no larger than a fingernail became a day's allowance. Yet even that would not last. They knew it. They did not speak of it openly, but the knowledge pressed upon them like the mountains themselves. The moment would come when there was nothing left to eat. The cold, though, was even more immediate. Frostbite nipped at fingers and toes. The wounded suffered worst, unable to generate warmth through movement. Breath turned shallow, eyes glazed. Some slipped quietly into death, their bodies stiffening under blankets, their companions weeping softly beside them. Each loss was a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death had become. And yet, in the midst of suffering, bonds deepened. Strangers became brothers, friends became lifelines. They told stories in the darkness, whispered memories of home, of mother's cooking stews, of the sound of city streets in Montevideo. These conversations, fragile as threads, wove them together, reminded them of the world that still existed beyond the mountains. On the third day, a boy named Nando Pardu awoke from a coma, his skull fractured during the crash. His first words were disoriented, his movements weak. Yet even in his broken state, his return was seen as a sign. If he could rise again, so too could they endure. Such symbols mattered here, where each dawn itself was a victory. The fuselage became not only their shelter but their universe. They patched its holes with luggage, with cushions, with scraps of clothing. They arranged the seats into crude bunks, building walls of cloth to keep out drafts. The smell inside grew foul, blood, sweat, unwashed bodies mingling with the metallic tang of the wreck. But still, it was safer than the open slopes. Still, it was theirs. Outside, the mountains loomed without change. The peaks remained white and aloof, indifferent to the tiny figures struggling at their base. The sun rose and set, casting long shadows across the snow. To the mountains, these days meant nothing. To the survivors, they were an eternity. In the quiet of night, some allowed themselves to imagine rescue. They pictured helicopters descending, rescuers in bright jackets carrying stretchers, the roar of engines promising warmth and food. These dreams sustained them, even as reality hardened. But already, the first seeds of despair had taken root. How long could they endure without food? How many nights could they survive pressed together, shivering in the fuselage? The mountains seemed endless, the silence unbroken. The cold was no longer an enemy that came and went. It had become a presence, constant and suffocating. The cold did not only attack the body. It entered the mind, numbing thought, dulling hope. It whispered that rest would be easier, that closing one's eyes and surrendering to sleep would end the suffering. More than once, companions shook one another awake, refusing to let sleep become death. They learned that survival required not only food and warmth but vigilance, against nature, against despair, even against the temptation of surrender. And so, in those first days, they discovered what it meant to live in the cold embrace of the Andes. It was not a battle to be won in a single effort, but a trial of endurance, fought breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Every sip of melted snow, every square of chocolate, every whispered story was a weapon in that fight. They did not yet know what greater trials lay ahead. But already, in the endless whiteness, the survivors of Flight 571 had begun to transform. They were no longer students, no longer merely athletes or travelers. They were a community forged by catastrophe, bound together by necessity, and shadowed by the immensity of the mountains that had claimed their world. The Andes had closed their arms around them, cold and merciless. And within that embrace, they would learn what it meant to endure. Part 4. Counting Losses. The days after the crash blurred into one another, stitched together by hunger, cold, and the sound of wind. In that thin air, time itself seemed altered. Hours dragged like weights, yet whole days slipped away unnoticed. The survivors were no longer passengers waiting for a destination. They were inhabitants of the fuselage, unwilling residents of a place that had not been built for life. It was during this early stretch that the presence of the dead began to weigh heavier than before. In the first hours after the crash, there had been no time to linger in grief. The wounded needed care, the living needed warmth, and shock dulled the sharp edges of mourning. But now, as the days settled into rhythm, the stillness of those who would never rise again pressed upon them. The fuselage was not large, and every body took up space. Some lay inside, covered with jackets or cloth, their faces hidden but not forgotten. Others remained outside, stiffening in the snow where they had fallen. Each time survivors stepped beyond the wreckage to gather luggage or search for supplies, they passed by the frozen forms of their companions. The sight was a wound that did not close. These were not strangers. They were teammates, friends, family. To see them silent and unmoving was to feel the strangeness of the world tilt even further. A decision had to be made. It came not from a single voice but from the murmured agreement of many. The dead could not remain inside with the living. The air was already foul with the press of bodies, the stench of blood and sweat, the metal tang of the broken fuselage. To remain among corpses was unbearable. So they carried them out. The act was quiet, almost reverent. Survivors lifted the bodies gently, as though not to disturb sleep, though sleep had long ended. They wrapped them in clothing, in blankets, in whatever scraps they could find, and bore them out into the snow. Each step was heavy, not only from the weight of the body but from the knowledge of who that person had been. A brother, a cousin, a lifelong friend who only days before had laughed over cards or sung with a guitar. They laid them side by side, near the fuselage, marking the place with stones. The snow swallowed sound, making the act eerily silent. No priests were there to give words, no rituals beyond the raw offering of grief. Yet prayers rose anyway, spoken in trembling voices, whispered through chattering teeth. In those moments, the survivors reached for God, for comfort, for meaning in a place that seemed emptied of it. Some prayed with conviction, others with desperation. A few simply bowed their heads, silent, unwilling or unable to form words. Faith, for many, had always been a quiet presence in life, a rhythm of Sunday services, of family rituals. But here, surrounded by death and cold, faith became either a lifeline or a question too heavy to lift. The counting of losses was not finished. Each day brought new reckonings. The injured, despite all care, sometimes slipped away in the night. A moan silenced forever, a hand that no longer gripped back. The group awoke to find another life extinguished, another companion added to the growing line outside. They counted again and again, tallying the living and the dead, the numbers shrinking. Each subtraction was felt not only as grief but as warning. Survival was not guaranteed. Each life lost was a mirror, reflecting the fragility of those who remained. Yet even in mourning, life demanded attention. The bodies of the dead became markers in the snow, but the hunger of the living gnawed without pause. Each ration was thinner than the last, each sip of melted snow more bitter for its insufficiency. They whispered to one another about rescue, reassuring, convincing, but the silence of the skies grew longer with each passing day. Grief reshaped itself in this place. In Montevideo, death would have brought funerals, families gathered in black, flowers laid on graves. Here, there were no coffins, no earth to cover the dead, only snow and stones. Mourning could not unfold in its usual rhythms. It became instead a quiet endurance, a sorrow carried within the chest, heavy but hidden beneath the work of survival. Some survivors spoke to the dead as they passed by, murmuring words of apology, of remembrance, as though conversation might bridge the divide. Others avoided looking, turning eyes away, trying to pretend that the bodies were not there. Each carried grief differently, yet all carried it, pressed into their minds like frost into bone. At night, when they huddled together inside the fuselage, memories slipped into the silence. A laugh recalled, a gesture, a story half finished before the crash. Names were spoken aloud, reverently, as though to keep them alive in memory if not in flesh. The cold walls of the fuselage heard more prayers, more whispered recollections, than any chapel might. And yet, alongside grief, life persisted. Jokes still flickered in the darkness, laughter rising weakly but stubbornly. Stories were told to distract from gnawing hunger, from the weight of sorrow. Human beings, even at the edge of survival, find ways to cling to the spark of living. The dead were honored not only in mourning but in the stubborn continuation of life, in the refusal to let despair consume the group whole. The mountains, indifferent as ever, watched without judgment. The peaks towered silent, the snow glared white by day and glowed blue by moonlight. The Andes had no care for grief, no regard for prayer. They were vast, eternal, unmoved. Yet to the survivors, they became both enemy and witness, a cathedral of stone and ice before which they whispered their sorrows. Counting losses became part of the rhythm of life there. Each day began with a roll call of voices, each name answered with a faint "here," each silence etched deeper into memory. The survivors learned to brace for silence, to expect it, to carry on regardless. And still, they hoped, for rescue, for some break in the mountain's hold, for the sound of engines that did not fade into distance. It was during these days that the survivors began to understand not only the harshness of the Andes, but the fragility of the human heart in the face of endless cold. Grief was no longer something to pass through, but something to live with, woven into each breath. They were learning the cruel arithmetic of survival, that life continued even as death grew beside it, that mourning must be carried but could not be allowed to paralyze. And so they pressed on, their numbers fewer, their spirits shadowed, but their will unbroken. Each loss was counted, each life remembered. Yet in the counting, they also reaffirmed the lives that remained. To endure, they had to live not only for themselves but for those who no longer could. The Andes gave them no comfort. The cold pressed against their bones, the silence weighed upon their minds. Yet within that frozen world, they carved out something fragile but real, a determination to remember, to grieve, and still to endure. This was what it meant, in those days, to count losses, not only to tally the dead but to hold on to the living, to let sorrow and survival walk hand in hand. The mountains had taken much already. The survivors vowed, quietly, that they would not surrender what remained. Part 5. The Waiting Game. The first days after the crash were bound together by a fragile thread of hope. It was not irrational hope, not fantasy, but the natural expectation that searchers would come. After all, the plane had a flight plan. Families knew they were on board. Governments would respond. Rescuers would be dispatched. That was the promise of the modern world. When a machine fell from the sky, the world noticed. And so they waited. Each morning they emerged from the fuselage, their eyes lifted toward the heavens. The sun climbed over jagged ridges and spilled into the valley where the broken plane lay half buried in snow. The light revealed the silence of their prison, but also the boundless sky that stretched above. It was in that sky that hope lived. They listened for engines. The human ear, when sharpened by desperation, can detect sounds with painful clarity. The whistle of wind through aluminum, the groan of shifting snow, the faint cracking of ice, all became familiar. But what they longed for was the low, distinct hum of an aircraft engine. When it came, hearts leapt. Men scrambled from the fuselage, waving jackets, flashing mirrors, shouting until their throats burned. Once, twice, 3 times, planes crossed the distant sky. The survivors screamed, their cries echoing off the stone walls of the Andes. They lit scraps of paper, hoping the smoke would rise high enough to be seen. They waved, they prayed, they pleaded, but the planes never circled back. They continued on, oblivious, dots swallowed by the horizon. The silence that followed was crushing. To feel unseen in such a vast wilderness was to know smallness in a way few ever experience. They were a handful of souls surrounded by mountains that rose like gods, white and merciless. The fuselage, their world entire, was no larger than a railway car. Against the immensity of the Andes, they were no more than a smudge in the snow. Still, each day, the ritual repeated. They waited. They listened. The faintest vibration in the air set hearts racing. The cruelest moments were when the wind itself mimicked engines, a low roar through peaks that tricked their ears. They would rush outside only to find emptiness above. Hunger grew sharper as they waited. The last scraps of chocolate, the final candies, were divided with trembling fingers. Each portion was so small that it melted away before it could be swallowed. They tried to savor the taste, to let sweetness linger, but the body is not easily fooled. Bellies ached, heads grew light. Even as their strength dwindled, they kept waiting, convinced that the sound of rescue would soon drown out the rumble of hunger. But days passed, and no one came. In the fuselage, conversations turned toward the outside world. What must their families be thinking? Surely the search planes had maps, radios, men trained to sweep valleys. Surely the pilots overhead had looked closely enough to see them. Surely the government would not abandon them. Yet doubt began to creep in. With each empty sky, confidence thinned. Some clung to faith with fierceness, convinced that God would not allow them to perish in such a place. Others fell silent, retreating into themselves, unwilling to voice the dread that was taking root, that perhaps they had been missed entirely, that perhaps they had fallen outside the grid of search patterns, lost in the folds of a mountain range that stretched for thousands of miles. The waiting itself became a form of suffering. Cold and hunger gnawed at the body, but uncertainty gnawed at the spirit. To wait is to relinquish control, to hand one's fate to forces unseen. For young men used to the vigor of sport, the clash of rugby matches, the discipline of training, such passivity was its own torment. They wanted to act, to fight, to move. Yet there was nowhere to go. The mountains hemmed them in on every side, walls of stone and ice too steep to climb, too vast to cross. Inside the fuselage, the days were marked by monotony. They lay shoulder to shoulder, pressed together for warmth, whispering stories to pass the hours. Some spoke of home, describing the scent of kitchens, the comfort of beds, the rhythm of city life in Montevideo. Others told jokes, their laughter weak but stubborn. The telling of stories became a shield against despair, a reminder that beyond the mountains life still existed. At night, the stars blazed above with cruel clarity. The survivors looked upward, awed and angered all at once. The heavens seemed close enough to touch, brilliant beyond imagining, yet indifferent. They traced constellations they had learned as children, Orion, the Southern Cross, each a reminder that the world outside had not vanished, only their place within it. On the 9th day, their fragile hope received a shattering blow. They had managed to recover a small transistor radio from the wreckage, a precious link to the outside world. At first it had brought comfort, faint voices crackling through static, reports of search efforts. The survivors gathered close, straining to catch every word. But the news that came chilled them more than the mountain air ever could. The official search had been called off. The announcement was simple, clinical. After days of scouring the mountains with no sign of wreckage, authorities had concluded that there were no survivors. Resources could not be spared for a hopeless mission. The families would mourn, the world would move on. Inside the fuselage, silence fell heavier than any avalanche. Each man stared at the floor, at the frost-rimed walls, at the frozen bodies of their companions outside. To be alive, yet declared dead, was a cruelty beyond words. Some wept openly, their sobs muffled by scarves and blankets. Others clenched their jaws, unwilling to give despair such an easy victory. A few whispered prayers, calling upon a God who now seemed more distant than ever. The waiting game had changed. No longer were they waiting for certain rescue. Now they were waiting with the knowledge that no one would come. And yet, the human spirit is stubborn. Even in the face of abandonment, a spark remained. If no one was coming, then somehow, they must find a way themselves. The mountains were immense, the cold unrelenting, but resignation was death. To live, they would have to become more than passengers, more than survivors. They would have to become explorers of the impossible, builders of hope in a place designed to extinguish it. Still, waiting did not end. It could not. They had nowhere else to go. Days continued, marked by hunger, by silence, by the thin line of breath that separated life from death. Each morning they looked at the sky, less with hope than with habit, a reflex of yearning. Each night they pressed together, whispering of food, of warmth, of families who believed them gone. The waiting game was cruel, but it was also a teacher. It taught patience beyond measure, it taught endurance, it taught the will to cling to life even when the world had turned away. And so they endured, in the frozen silence of the Andes, waiting not for certain rescue but for the strength to carve their own. Part 6. Mountains of Hunger. The small pile of food that had once seemed a lifeline was now gone. The final fragments of chocolate, the last sips of wine, the crumbs of crackers that had been divided and redivided with almost religious care, all were consumed. The survivors of Flight 571 sat inside their battered fuselage, staring at one another with hollow eyes, their stomachs aching with an emptiness that words could not soften. Hunger had been present from the beginning, a gnawing reminder that the body demands what the mountains will not give. At first it had been possible to ignore, to trick with small morsels, to dull with prayer or distraction. But now hunger no longer whispered. It screamed. The men grew thin quickly. Cheeks sank, ribs showed beneath layers of mismatched clothing. Their movements slowed. Rising from the floor of the fuselage became an act of will. Tasks that once seemed trivial, walking to collect snow, adjusting bandages, rearranging luggage, now demanded strength that had to be rationed like food. The cold deepened the suffering. The body burns its own reserves in an effort to keep warm. Fat vanished, then muscle, until even shivering became too costly. Fingers trembled as they tried to grip makeshift tools. Knees buckled during simple chores. Weakness became a constant companion, as real and oppressive as the wind that howled through the valley. They searched again and again through the wreckage, desperate for something overlooked. Every suitcase was opened, every pocket turned out. Hope rose at the discovery of a forgotten pack of peanuts, only to collapse when its contents proved spoiled. They boiled strips of leather torn from luggage, chewing until their jaws ached, but it gave no sustenance. Hunger mocked every effort. Conversations grew quieter. Where once the fuselage had been filled with stories and laughter, now it was hushed, voices too weak to rise. Men lay in silence, staring at the curved ceiling, their thoughts circling endlessly around food. They spoke of kitchens at home, of the scent of bread baking, of meat sizzling in pans. They described meals in such detail that for a moment, listening, one could almost taste them. But imagination was cruel. When the words faded, hunger returned sharper than before. The human body can endure thirst for only a few days, but hunger stretches longer, eroding strength slowly. Yet the mind is not so patient. Hunger reshapes thought, driving out distractions, narrowing focus until every sound, every memory, every dream is touched by the absence of food. Some survivors dreamed vividly of banquets, waking with mouths wet from imagined feasts. Others could not sleep at all, their bellies twisting, their minds racing through impossible plans. Still they tried to maintain order. Each morning, those with strength ventured outside to gather snow, to check the bodies of the dead, to scan the sky with weary eyes. Inside, the wounded were tended as best as possible. Yet even the care they could offer was dulled by weakness. A hand holding a bandage shook, eyes dimmed with exhaustion. The sick grew sicker, the injured weaker. It was in this stage that despair began to whisper. If food did not come, what then? Some prayed harder, asking God for a miracle, for manna to fall from the heavens, for some hidden store of supplies to appear in the snow. Others turned inward, silent, unwilling to voice the thought that haunted them all, that survival might demand something unthinkable. The mountains, as always, gave nothing. The peaks towered, majestic and merciless, their white slopes untouched. No birds circled. No animals crossed the valley. The Andes were a world of stone and ice, stripped of all sustenance. Even the air seemed empty, thin, resisting each breath. Weakness became so pervasive that laughter itself felt foreign. The young men who had once filled the fuselage with songs now struggled to rise, to speak, to lift their heads. They lay in rows, pressed together for warmth, their bodies skeletal under layers of clothing. The sound of wind was louder than conversation. And yet, somehow, hope did not vanish entirely. Some still spoke of rescue, insisting that searchers might return. Others dreamed of climbing out of the valley, of reaching Chilean villages hidden beyond the ridges. But such dreams felt impossibly far. Each attempt to walk even a short distance left men staggering, gasping for breath. The idea of crossing mountains seemed more fantasy than plan. The hunger reached into every corner of their minds. Even in prayer, concentration faltered, thoughts drifting toward food. Even in silence, imaginations conjured meals. Hunger was not simply a sensation. It was a presence, sitting with them, shaping every word, every gesture, every dream. It became clear to all that they could not continue like this. Some tried to stretch the illusion, insisting they might endure another few days. Others admitted openly what all had begun to sense, that their bodies were consuming themselves, that death was not distant but drawing closer with each sunrise. The survivors spoke quietly, hesitantly, about possibilities. They wondered what the world outside was doing, whether their families still prayed for them, whether anyone believed they lived. They wondered how long a human body could last without food. They wondered, in words barely spoken, what they might do if the mountains offered no other path. And still they waited. The Andes remained silent, immense, and indifferent. The mountains gave no food, no warmth, no sign of mercy. They gave only cold, only silence, only endless white slopes that stretched beyond the horizon. Inside the fuselage, the survivors pressed closer together, bones against bones, eyes closed in exhausted half-sleep. Their bodies weakened, their spirits frayed. Hunger had become their world, a mountain as insurmountable as those of stone that towered above. This was the trial they faced now, Not the violence of the crash, not the grief of counting losses, not the long days of waiting, but the slow, relentless siege of hunger. It was a siege that would not end on its own. It would demand a choice, one that none of them wished to imagine but all knew was coming. For now, they endured, clinging to the fragile rhythm of life. Breath by breath, hour by hour. In the frozen silence of the Andes, the mountains of hunger rose higher than any peak outside. Part 7. The Avalanche. The Andes had already shown their indifference. They had taken lives in the crash, stolen warmth in the nights, and gnawed at flesh with hunger. The survivors believed they had learned the rhythm of the mountains, to expect the cold, to ration strength, to endure silence. But the Andes were not finished. It began without warning, as many disasters do. The day had been spent as so many others, gathering snow for water, checking the fuselage for weaknesses, whispering prayers as darkness drew close. The survivors settled into their places inside the broken shell, pressing against one another in rows, blankets and scraps of clothing piled high in a futile barrier against the night. The wind whistled through cracks in the metal. Breath misted in the dim light. Slowly, exhaustion pulled them toward uneasy sleep. Then came the roar. At first it sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart. A deep, rolling thunder that grew louder with terrifying speed. The fuselage trembled. Men stirred, blinking awake in confusion, their hearts racing before their minds had caught up. Someone shouted a warning, but the words were swallowed in an instant. The avalanche struck. Snow poured down the mountainside, a river of ice and weight and speed. It engulfed the fuselage in a single crushing movement, smashing against the torn aluminum, surging inside through broken seams. Darkness fell instantly, as if the very air had been stolen. The survivors were buried where they lay, the weight of snow pressing against their chests, their faces, their lungs. Panic erupted. Men thrashed, clawing upward, their arms pinned by the press of snow. Breath became impossible, each gasp a fight against suffocation. Cries of terror echoed in the blackness, muffled by snow, by metal, by the sheer immensity of the avalanche's grip. Some managed to free their mouths, gasping in slivers of air through tiny holes. Others were silenced forever, their cries cut short as snow filled the spaces where breath should have been. Minutes stretched into eternity. The avalanche roared past, its force fading, but the survivors were left entombed in its aftermath. The fuselage was half buried, its interior a coffin of ice. Inside, those who still breathed clawed desperately, their fingers numb, their nails breaking as they scraped at the snow that pinned them. A few managed to break through to small air pockets, gasping with sobs of relief. Others were dragged free by companions, their bodies trembling, eyes wide with panic. But too many did not rise. The avalanche had taken more lives, suffocating them in silence before help could come. When the survivors finally carved space enough to breathe, they collapsed in exhaustion, the cold pressing harder than ever. The fuselage, once their refuge, had become their trap. Snow blocked every opening, sealing them in darkness. The air grew foul, heavy with carbon dioxide from dozens of frantic lungs. Each breath became shallower, weaker. They realized, with a sinking clarity, that if they did not act quickly, even those who had survived the avalanche would die of suffocation. Weak hands became frantic tools. They clawed at the snow blocking the exits, passing handfuls from one to another, pushing it down beneath their bodies to make room for breath. The work was agonizingly slow. Fingers froze, lungs heaved, hearts pounded. The wounded could not help, only lie still and listen as their companions fought the mountains once again. At last, after what felt like hours, one of the exits was forced open. A shaft of icy air spilled inside, sharp and biting but full of life. Men pressed toward it, gulping at the cold as though it were nectar. The avalanche had buried them, but not completely. They had cheated death once more, by inches. When dawn arrived, its light revealed the scale of what had happened. The fuselage was buried to its windows, snow piled high against its battered sides. The valley outside was transformed, no longer a gentle slope, but a field of churned snow and debris. The avalanche had swept clean the slope, leaving behind a scar of white destruction. And the dead. 8 more lives had been taken in the night. Men who had once laughed, prayed, and whispered of home now lay stiff beneath the snow. Some had been suffocated in their sleep, never waking to the terror. Others had fought, clawing until their strength failed. Their absence was a new wound in the already fragile heart of the group. The survivors mourned in silence, their grief dulled by exhaustion. There were no tears left to shed, only hollow gazes, only the knowledge that the Andes had claimed more. Their numbers were dwindling, their world shrinking. Each dawn seemed to bring not hope, but loss. The avalanche had done more than steal lives. It had stolen the last remnants of safety. If even their shelter could betray them, then nowhere was secure. The fuselage, half buried, reeked of damp snow and sweat. The walls dripped with melting ice. They dug tirelessly to keep air flowing, carving small tunnels through which they could crawl, but every moment inside was shadowed by the fear that more snow might fall, that another wave might bury them completely. Nights grew restless. Few could sleep deeply, their ears tuned to every rumble from the slopes above. Each gust of wind against the fuselage sounded like the start of another avalanche. Men woke in gasps, clutching one another, their hearts racing until silence returned. The mountains had taught them fear anew, fear deeper than hunger, deeper than cold. And yet, as with every blow, life clung stubbornly. They continued to tend the wounded, though bandages were soaked and stiff with ice. They continued to melt snow, to share warmth, to whisper prayers. They buried the dead again, or rather covered them, snow serving as both grave and shroud. Each loss was marked by words spoken softly, promises that they would not be forgotten. The avalanche had been more than a natural disaster. It was a message, a reminder that the Andes themselves were not passive. The mountains moved, shifted, struck without warning. To live here was not simply to endure hunger and cold. It was to live under constant threat, knowing that at any moment the very ground could rise against them. In the days that followed, the survivors carried the weight of the avalanche inside them. They were thinner now, weaker, their faces hollow and drawn. But their eyes had changed most of all. They no longer looked outward with the same expectation of rescue, nor inward with the same easy hope of survival. They looked instead with a grim awareness, an understanding that every hour was borrowed. The avalanche had taken much, but it had also revealed something unspoken. If they were to survive, it would not be by waiting alone. The mountains would not allow it. They would have to fight, to act, to endure choices as terrible as the storm itself. For now, they huddled once more inside the battered fuselage, their breaths rising in white mist, their bodies pressed close against the cold. Outside, the mountains loomed silent, their slopes glistening in the pale sun. Snow glittered, beautiful and deadly, a reminder of the night when death itself had poured down the valley and nearly swallowed them whole. And still, against all odds, they endured. Part 8. Whispers of Despair. The avalanche had stolen more lives, and with it, more of the fragile security the survivors once felt. They no longer trusted the slopes above them, no longer trusted even the fuselage that served as their only home. Each night they lay awake, listening for the deep rumble that might signal another wave of snow. Each gust of wind felt like a warning. Each creak of the fuselage sent hearts racing. The Andes had proven they were not still, not passive, but alive with hidden movements. The cold was constant, but hunger now ruled every thought. Days had passed since the last true meal. What remained of their bodies was stretched thin, cheekbones sharp under pale skin, lips cracked, hands trembling with weakness. Even simple movements required effort, sitting up, walking outside to gather snow, lifting an injured companion to adjust a blanket. Their strength had been consumed as fuel, leaving behind only hollow shells of the young men who had once boarded the plane with laughter and songs. And into that emptiness crept despair. It did not arrive loudly. It came in whispers, quiet and insidious, winding its way through the silence of the fuselage. Men who once spoke eagerly now fell silent for hours, staring at nothing, their minds retreating inward. Others muttered restlessly, words blurring into fragments of prayer, or half-remembered conversations with loved ones. Some dreamed with their eyes open, convinced for moments at a time that they could see their homes, their families, a meal laid before them. Hallucinations played tricks on exhausted minds, the line between memory and reality fraying in the thin air. At night, dreams were vivid and cruel. Some survivors woke in tears, convinced they had been eating only moments before, their mouths still tasting food that was never there. Others awoke screaming, caught in nightmares of avalanches, of crashing metal, of suffocation beneath snow. The fuselage became a chamber of restless spirits, each man haunted by visions he could neither control nor escape. Faith became both a comfort and a struggle. Many turned to prayer, their voices rising softly in the darkness, calling upon God to deliver them from their frozen prison. Rosaries were whispered bead by bead, psalms recited from memory, hymns hummed under breath. For some, faith provided strength, a reason to believe that their suffering was not meaningless. For others, it sharpened the torment, for they wondered why their prayers went unanswered, why rescue had not come, why a merciful God allowed them to linger in hunger and cold. Arguments sometimes sparked, brief flares of frustration in the darkness. A man muttering hopelessly might be silenced by another urging prayer. A prayer spoken too loudly might irritate one lost in bitter silence. But the quarrels never lasted. Exhaustion swallowed anger, leaving only the same despair, the same gnawing hunger. In those days, conversations changed. They no longer spoke of rugby matches, of victories and rivalries, of the easy camaraderie of sport. Instead, they spoke of families with a desperation that bordered on worship. They described mothers' voices, fathers' hands, the laughter of sisters and brothers. They described in loving detail the meals of their childhoods, soups simmering on stoves, bread pulled warm from ovens, meats grilled with fire's smoke. These memories became both torture and salvation. Torture for the hunger they inflamed, salvation for the humanity they preserved. There were moments of eerie quiet, when the fuselage was still but for the sound of breath. In those silences, despair's whispers grew louder. Some men thought of surrender, to lie back, to close their eyes, to let sleep carry them into stillness. Death, in those moments, seemed less an enemy than a release. But others resisted fiercely, shaking companions awake, urging them to hold on, to breathe, to fight against the seductive pull of rest. Outside, the mountains remained unbroken. White slopes stretched endlessly, peaks jagged against the sky. The sun rose, blinding on the snow, and set, leaving the valley in bitter cold. No sign of animals, no sign of travelers, no sound but the moan of wind. The Andes gave nothing. And so the survivors turned more and more inward, into memory, into prayer, into whispers. Despair lingered like a shadow, but even shadows exist only where light remains. And that light, however faint, still flickered. They clung to one another, pressing close in the nights, reminding themselves that they were not entirely alone. A hand held in darkness, a whispered word of encouragement, a prayer spoken together. These were small acts, but they mattered. For the mountains could strip them of food, of warmth, of strength. But so long as they could still whisper to one another, despair would not claim them all. The Andes were vast, merciless, eternal. But within the battered fuselage, voices still rose, weak, trembling, sometimes broken, yet still carrying the stubborn spark of life. Part 9. The Decision. Hunger had long since moved beyond discomfort. It was no longer a growl in the stomach, something to be endured until the next meal. It had become a shadow that wrapped itself around every thought, a constant ache in the bones, a dizziness in the head, a trembling in the hands. It hollowed the survivors until they felt scarcely human. They had stretched every scrap of food as far as it could go. Chocolate was gone. Candy, gone. The last morsels of dried fruit, gone. They had boiled strips of leather from luggage straps, chewed on cotton, sipped melted snow in hope it might fill the emptiness. Nothing remained. Their bodies were failing, their muscles wasting, their strength evaporating like mist. The fuselage, once filled with the restless energy of young men, was now subdued. Many lay silently, conserving breath, too weak to speak. Eyes stared blankly, lips cracked, minds drifting in and out of consciousness. Even the wounded no longer cried out in pain. Their suffering had passed into a quiet beyond complaint. And yet, the will to live lingered. Weak though they were, the survivors were not ready to surrender. But the question pressed harder each day. How could they live when the mountains gave nothing? It was then that whispers began to form. Whispers of the unthinkable. At first, no one dared to voice it aloud. The thought itself was an intrusion, an idea so terrible it seemed a betrayal of faith, of morality, of humanity itself. But hunger erodes not only flesh, but silence. And soon, the words emerged, fragile and hesitant. What if the only nourishment left was among them already? The dead lay outside, preserved by snow, bodies untouched since the avalanche. Friends, brothers, teammates. They had once laughed together, played together, prayed together. And now they were silent, their bodies whole, their presence undeniable. To consider such a thing felt monstrous. To eat the flesh of companions? To break the most sacred boundary of human life? The very thought sent shivers of revulsion through them. Many recoiled, shaking their heads, whispering prayers against the suggestion. Some wept, begging God for another way, for a miracle that would spare them from such a choice. But others, weakened, stared at the snow in silence, their hollowed eyes betraying what their lips could not yet say, that without food, they would all die, and soon. The discussions grew more open. They spoke softly, afraid that even the mountains might judge them. They weighed morality against survival, faith against desperation. They argued about the sanctity of life, about whether the soul remained with the body after death. If the soul had gone to God, was the flesh only an empty shell, a vessel no longer sacred? Could taking it be seen not as desecration, but as sacrifice, the dead giving life to the living? These were not debates of philosophy. They were the agonized cries of men with sunken bellies and fading strength, clinging to scraps of reason in the face of despair. Some refused outright. They declared they would rather die than cross that line. Better to go to God with their bodies untainted than to live by such means. Others argued that God had given them brains and will, and perhaps he expected them to use both in order to survive. To waste what was before them, they said, would be to turn away from the very chance at life. Prayer circles formed, men clasping hands, begging forgiveness even as they considered the act. Tears fell freely. They asked for strength, for guidance, for the absolution of those whose bodies they contemplated using. Some swore that if they lived, they would spend their lives honoring the dead. Others asked the dead themselves for permission, whispering to the bodies outside, pleading to be understood. At last, the decision was made. It was not unanimous, nor was it made lightly. It was made with trembling hands, with hearts heavy, with minds certain that no darker road had ever been walked. They agreed that to live, they would have to do the unthinkable. When the first cut was made, silence filled the fuselage. No one spoke. Breath came shallow, eyes turned away, some weeping into blankets. Those who could not bear it closed their eyes, whispering prayers for forgiveness. Those who participated did so with reverence, with hands that shook not only from weakness but from the enormity of what they were doing. The flesh of friends was no feast. It was a bitter necessity, consumed in silence, with heads bowed. There was no satisfaction, no joy, only the dull acknowledgement that life might stretch one day further. And yet, when strength flickered back into limbs, when voices grew steadier, when the hollow ache dulled even slightly, they knew the choice had kept them alive. They vowed never to forget. They promised to carry the memory of those who had given unwilling sacrifice. They whispered names aloud, as if to remind themselves that these were not strangers, not objects, but brothers whose last gift was the preservation of life. The decision marked them all. They knew that if rescue ever came, the world might never understand. Judgment would follow, condemnation perhaps. But judgment mattered little compared to survival. The mountains did not care for morality, only for endurance. And in their frozen silence, the survivors had chosen to endure. In the nights that followed, despair did not vanish. It lingered, whispering still, reminding them of the line they had crossed. Some found peace in the belief that they had done what was necessary. Others wrestled with guilt, their faith shaken, their dreams haunted. But all breathed still, their hearts beating, their bodies clinging to life one day more. The Andes had demanded a price. They had paid it, with reverence, with grief, with trembling hands. And the mountains, indifferent as ever, stood watch in silence. Part 10. Walking to Nowhere. The decision had been made. They had taken the step that none of them could have imagined before the crash. It had given them strength, not abundance, not comfort, but just enough to stand, to think, to plan. For the first time since the avalanche, there was a fragile sense that perhaps survival was still within reach. And with that flicker of strength came a new urgency. Rescue, they now knew, was unlikely to come. The radio had told them as much. The search had been called off. No more planes would scour the valleys. No more helicopters would hover above the peaks. They were alone. If they were to live, they would have to leave the fuselage behind and find a way out of the mountains themselves. The thought was simple enough in words, but the reality loomed as vast as the Andes themselves. To leave meant crossing snowfields that stretched endlessly, climbing ridges that towered like walls, descending valleys that plunged into shadows. It meant stepping away from the broken fuselage, their only shelter, their only place of order, and entering a wilderness of ice that cared nothing for their determination. Still, they could not remain forever. Weakness lingered, but so did resolve. Plans began to take shape. A small group would scout ahead, testing the terrain, seeing if any path led out of the valley. The rest would stay behind, conserving strength, tending the wounded. The chosen men wrapped themselves in layers of clothing, tying rags around their feet for makeshift boots. They fashioned crude packs from seat covers, filling them with scraps of food and bits of metal to catch the sun as signals. Before leaving, they embraced their companions, each gesture heavy with unspoken fear. No one knew if they would return. They stepped out into the blinding snow, their figures small against the immensity of the mountains. The others watched from the fuselage, their eyes following until the men became specks moving slowly upward along the ridge. Hope traveled with them, fragile as the thin air. The climb was brutal from the first step. The snow swallowed their legs to the knees, each stride a battle against exhaustion. The sun glared so fiercely off the white slopes that their eyes burned. The air grew thinner as they climbed, their lungs laboring, hearts pounding in chests already weakened by hunger. They paused often, bent double, gasping. Every few meters felt like kilometers. The mountains mocked their efforts. What seemed from the fuselage like a ridge within reach proved to be only the first of many, each rise revealing yet another beyond. The Andes stretched without end, their scale deceptive, cruel. Hours passed, and still the ridge line remained distant. At nightfall, they returned. Their faces were gaunt, their steps faltering, their bodies trembling with cold. They collapsed inside the fuselage, whispering only that the way was harder than imagined, that the mountains were larger than the eye could measure. Their voices carried not only exhaustion, but something heavier, despair. Yet the attempt had planted a seed. If one journey failed, perhaps another might succeed. They could not abandon the idea of escape, for to remain forever at the fuselage meant eventual death. And so, after rest, others tried. Small groups set out, staggering into the snow, driven by the dream of finding villages, of finding rescue, of seeing a tree or a road or any sign of life. Each attempt ended the same. The men would climb until their strength gave out, their bodies collapsing in drifts, their breath tearing at their lungs. They would stare at endless white, at peaks still higher, at horizons that offered no promise. And then they would turn back, stumbling, defeated, their hope dimmer than before. The fuselage became a revolving door of attempts and failures. Each new group left with solemn determination. Each returned with faces hollow, their words soft with despair. They spoke of ridges that stretched into nothing, of valleys that ended in walls of ice, of snow so deep it swallowed them whole. Even so, no one mocked the efforts. Each attempt was an act of courage, a gesture of defiance against the mountains. But each failure etched the truth deeper into their hearts. The Andes were too vast to cross without strength, too merciless to yield to determination alone. Inside, the waiting continued. Those who stayed behind pressed closer together, whispering prayers for those who had gone out. Each time the figures reappeared on the slope, a small sigh of relief passed through the fuselage. They had returned alive, though not victorious. Days blurred together. Hunger still gnawed, cold still bit, grief still lingered. The attempts to escape became markers of time, proof that they had not surrendered completely. Yet despair whispered louder, asking questions none wanted to answer. What if no one ever succeeded? What if the mountains swallowed them one by one, until none remained? And yet, even despair could not erase the stubborn flame of will. They continued to dream of escape, to plan, to argue about routes, about who should go, about how far they might reach. Hope, though battered, refused to vanish entirely. For to walk, even to nowhere, was better than to lie still and wait for death. The Andes remained silent, indifferent. Peaks glistened, valleys lay in shadow, wind howled across the snow. The mountains gave no path, no mercy, no sign. But within the fuselage, Men still dreamed of walking out, of finding life beyond the frozen horizon. And dreams, however fragile, were still stronger than despair. Part 11. The Climb. The failed attempts weighed heavily on the survivors, but they had not broken their will. Each return from the slopes had taught them something, about the depth of snow, about the way distance deceives in the thin air, about the scale of the Andes that dwarfed all human effort. If they were to leave this valley, they would need not only determination but preparation. And so, slowly, they began to plan. Those with the most strength gathered around the fuselage, speaking in hushed tones. Their bodies were frail, but their minds were sharp. They would build clothing from what they had, layer upon layer of shirts and pants, stitched with cords torn from luggage. They would fashion boots from seat cushions and insulation, wrapping their feet until they resembled clumsy bundles rather than shoes. They would make packs from metal frames and straps, filling them with the few scraps of nourishment they had, with melted snow sealed into bottles, with fragments of hope. But the greatest decision was harder. They knew that to cross the Andes would not take hours, or even a day. It would take many days, perhaps more than a week. And to survive such a journey, they would need to carry with them sustenance, no matter how unthinkable the source. Once more, the weight of their earlier decision pressed upon them, and once more, they bowed their heads in prayer, asking forgiveness from the friends who would travel with them not in life but in the form of flesh. When preparations were complete, the moment came to choose who would go. Not everyone could risk it. The weakest would remain at the fuselage, clinging to the fragile shelter it provided. But the strongest, those who still had the will to stand, to climb, to fight for distance, would attempt the crossing. Among them was Nando Paradu, whose survival after head injury had already seemed miraculous. Alongside him were Roberto Canessa and Antonio Vizintin, men whose bodies were wasted but whose spirits still carried fire. They embraced the others before leaving, words failing, eyes shining with both fear and determination. The ones who stayed behind pressed hands to their shoulders, whispering prayers for protection, promising to hold on until they returned with help. Then, one morning, they began the climb. The air outside cut like knives, thin and sharp. The sun blazed against snow so bright it seemed to sear their vision. Each step was a battle, their legs sinking deep, their lungs gasping in the thin altitude. The valley fell away behind them, the fuselage shrinking into a silver speck half buried in white. The mountains rose ahead, vast, immense, beautiful and merciless. They walked in silence at first, saving breath. Their packs were heavy, not in the way of travelers carrying food and tools, but in the way of men carrying the burden of survival. Each footstep crunched into snow, each breath rasped through chapped lips, each heartbeat thudded in their ears. As they climbed, the landscape changed. Valleys stretched into endless bowls of white, ridges cut against the sky like jagged teeth. Glaciers shimmered in the sunlight, rivers of ice frozen in mid-motion. The silence was immense, broken only by the sound of their own labored steps. No bird cried, no water flowed, no sign of life stirred. The Andes were a cathedral of stillness, and the three men were its smallest figures. The climb was punishing. Hunger gnawed constantly, though they chewed small scraps when strength failed. Their feet blistered inside makeshift boots, their skin burned by sun and wind. At night they dug shallow hollows in the snow, lying pressed against one another beneath scraps of fabric, shivering until dawn. Sleep was thin, broken by cold that reached into their bones. Yet each morning they rose again, dragging themselves upward, driven by the image of villages that must lie somewhere beyond the peaks. On the third day, they reached a ridge they had long seen from below. The climb was agonizing, each meter gained only by staggering steps and long pauses. At last, they stood upon its crest, gasping, their hearts hammering. Before them stretched not the green valleys of Chile they had prayed to see, but more mountains. Range upon range, white and endless, horizon to horizon. For a moment, despair threatened to crush them. To see how far they still had to go, to realize that their prison was not one valley but a fortress of peaks stretching endlessly, it was almost too much. They sank into the snow, their shoulders slumped, their eyes hollow. But then, slowly, they rose. If the mountains demanded more, then more they would give. Turning back meant death. Moving forward, however impossible, was the only path. They pressed on. Day after day, step after step, their bodies wasting further, their spirits stretched thin but unbroken. They climbed ridges and descended into valleys, their footprints the only mark upon the snow. They spoke little, conserving breath, but when words came they were often prayers, or fragments of memory, or encouragements whispered through cracked lips. At times hallucinations returned, the mind conjuring images of water, of trees, of voices carried on the wind. Yet they clung to one another, shaking each other awake when exhaustion threatened to drag them into fatal sleep. Companionship became their greatest tool, the knowledge that no man climbed alone, that each step was carried not only by his own will but by the will of those beside him. Behind them, in the fuselage, the others waited. Each day they looked to the slopes, hoping to see figures return. Each night they prayed for their companion's safety, whispering names into the cold air. They knew the mountains were merciless, knew that the three might never return. But still they hoped, because hope was all they had left. And so the climb continued. The Andes loomed without end, their peaks sharp against the sky, their valleys buried in shadow. But within them, three men staggered forward, their bodies frail but their spirits burning. Each step was a defiance against despair, each breath an act of survival. The climb was not only across snow and stone, but across the very limits of human endurance. Part 12. The White Desert. The climb had carried them beyond the narrow valley of the fuselage, beyond the slopes where their world had shrunk into hunger and despair. Now they stood at the edge of a vast expanse, a place that seemed less like Earth and more like another planet. Before them stretched a plain of snow, endless and white, rolling into ridges and rises that dissolved into a horizon without end. The Andes, in this place, did not feel like mountains in the way valleys and peaks usually define them. They felt like a desert, not of sand, but of ice. A white desert. Nando Paradu, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin paused at the crest of the ridge, their breath rasping, their bodies trembling. The air was thinner here, and every lungful burned. They squinted against the glare of the sun, eyes watering despite cloth wrapped around their faces. They had imagined that beyond the ridge they might see green valleys, perhaps a forest, perhaps even the winding line of a road. But there was nothing of the kind. Only more whiteness. The moment crushed them. Their dream of stepping over one wall of mountains to glimpse the world beyond shattered into silence. Before them was not deliverance, but another trial. Yet even as despair clawed at their hearts, something deeper stirred, a refusal to turn back. Behind them, their friends waited in the fuselage. Men who could no longer climb. Men who had pinned their fragile hopes on this climb. To return empty-handed was to condemn them. So they pressed forward. The snow was soft, swallowing their legs to the knee. Each step required effort that drained them of breath. Their packs, heavy with the weight of necessity, pressed into their shoulders. The sun glared mercilessly, reflecting off the snow until their vision blurred with bright spots. The air was still, so silent that the only sounds were their ragged breathing and the crunch of feet breaking through ice. It was walking, and yet it was not. Walking in the white desert was not movement from one place to another. It was endurance in its purest form, each step a battle, each meter a victory. The world did not seem to change. No matter how far they trudged, the horizon remained the same, distant, white, unreachable. Time lost its meaning. Hours bled into one another. They stopped often, collapsing onto the snow, their chests heaving, their limbs shaking. When they rose again, it was not from renewed strength, but from the sheer will not to stop forever. Nights were crueler still. As dusk fell, the temperature plummeted. The wind, absent during the day, returned with a howl, sweeping across the open plains with a bite that pierced through every layer of clothing. They dug shallow pits in the snow, lying pressed against one another, covering themselves with scraps of fabric. Sleep was thin, broken by shivers, broken by the cold gnawing at their bones. At times, they drifted into dreams so vivid that they were unsure upon waking whether they had been asleep at all. One night, Roberto muttered that he had dreamed of walking into a warm house, of sitting at a table laid with food. Nando listened, silent, his own mind filled with the faces of his mother and sister, both lost in the crash. He carried them with him as ghosts, not as burdens, but as companions, their memory pushing him to endure where his body faltered. Morning always came too quickly. The sun rose cold and blinding, its glare forcing them to wrap rags tighter around their eyes. They staggered to their feet, shoulders aching, legs trembling, and began again. Step after step, hour after hour, the white desert gave no sign of progress. Yet they pressed on, for to stop was to surrender. The landscape around them was at once beautiful and merciless. Peaks gleamed in the distance, their ridges sharp against a sky of impossible blue. Glacier shimmered with hues of silver and pale green, as though lit from within. Shadows stretched long across the snow, painting patterns of light and darkness. In another world, in another time, the sight might have filled them with awe. Here, it was only a reminder of their fragility. Their bodies weakened further. Lips split and bled, skin blistered with sunburn, eyes burned despite their makeshift coverings. Their feet, wrapped in rags and scraps, blistered until each step was agony. Hunger remained constant, an ache that dulled thought, but small portions of flesh, consumed reverently, in silence, kept them moving. There were moments when the world itself seemed to waver. Heat mirages shimmered in the snow, pools of water that vanished as they approached. Rocks in the distance appeared as houses, as men, as trees, only to dissolve into emptiness. Hallucinations walked beside them, voices whispering, visions of family beckoning. They spoke to these phantoms at times, only to realize they were alone once more. Yet within the madness, companionship anchored them. When one faltered, the others pulled him up. When one sank to his knees, whispering of surrender, the others pressed him forward, reminding him that they did not climb for themselves alone, but for everyone still waiting. After days of walking, they reached another ridge, higher than any they had yet climbed. The ascent was torture. The slope rose steeply, the snow deep, the air razor-thin. They crawled at times, their packs dragging behind them, their breaths shallow and ragged. At last they reached the crest, collapsing into the snow. For a long time, none of them moved, too weak to even lift their heads. When they did, they saw something different. Far in the distance, beyond the white desert, beyond the ridges, the horizon was no longer only white. There were streaks of brown, of gray, of color that did not belong to snow. It was land. It was rock. It was the world beyond the ice. The sight breathed fire into their hearts. It was still impossibly far, still separated by valleys and peaks, but it was there. Proof that the Andes did not stretch forever. Proof that life lay beyond. They wept, silently, their tears freezing on their cheeks. For the first time since leaving the fuselage, they allowed themselves to believe they might succeed. The climb continued, day after day, step after step. Each night was agony, each morning torment, but now they had seen what lay ahead. The white desert, endless as it seemed, was not infinite. It had an end. And if they could reach it, perhaps they could find trees, rivers, villages, people. Perhaps they could return with rescue. Behind them, the fuselage remained buried in the valley. Their companions still waited, still prayed, still pressed close against the cold. They did not know how far the climbers had gone, or whether they still lived. But they held on, whispering names into the night, believing that their brothers were walking towards salvation. And in the white desert, 3 figures staggered onward, smaller than ants against the immensity of the Andes. Their footprints stretched behind them, the only mark in a world of silence. Step after step, breath after breath, they carved a path across a landscape that seemed designed to erase them. The Andes watched, vast and unmoved. Yet within them, men still climbed, still walked, still dreamed. And the white desert, though endless, was being crossed. Part 13. The Descent. The ridge had been the promise. From its crest, they had seen what none of them dared believe until that moment, the end of the white desert. Beyond the last fields of snow and ice, beyond the slopes that had swallowed their strength day after day, there was color. Brown, gray, even faint streaks of green. It was not close, but it was there. It was the world beyond the mountains. That vision carried them forward. Their legs trembled with every step, their breath rattled in the thin air, but their hearts beat with a fire that had nearly gone out before. They had walked through silence, through hallucination, through despair, but now each footprint pressed into the snow with purpose. The descent was not easy. The slope ahead was steep, and the snow treacherous. Their makeshift boots slipped on icy patches, sending them sprawling, their hands raw as they clawed back to balance. Packs dug into their shoulders. Their ribs ached, their lips split, their eyes burned from days of sun glare. Yet even as their bodies screamed, their minds whispered encouragement. One step more, then another still. The air changed as they descended. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But after days spent gasping for every breath, they felt the difference. Oxygen returned, slowly, like a forgotten friend. Their lungs expanded more easily. The burn in their chests softened. It was not comfort. They were still weak, still starving, but it was a gift, and they embraced it with every breath. The silence changed too. For so long, their world had been filled with only the sound of wind and their own footsteps. Now, faintly, other sounds reached them. At first it was a trickle, barely audible. Then it grew, the sound of water. Somewhere below, hidden in shadowed valleys, snowmelt tumbled over rock, carving streams that had long been buried beneath the silence of the high peaks. They stopped, listening, tears brimming in their eyes. The sound of running water was proof of life, proof of movement, proof of a world that did not end in ice. As the days of descent continued, the landscape revealed more. Rocks jutted through the snow, grey and brown against the white. At first they were small, half-buried. Then they grew larger, whole ridges of stone rising like spines. The feel beneath their feet shifted, not only the soft collapse of snow, but the firmness of earth. They bent, touched it with trembling hands, as if to assure themselves it was real. And then came color. It was faint, almost hidden. A smear of green along the edge of a stone. Lichen, clinging stubbornly to life where snow receded. To anyone else it would have been nothing, a pale moss, hardly more than a stain. But to the climbers, it was a miracle. They touched it with reverence, fingers brushing the tiny leaves. For the first time in months, they had seen living growth. The world was changing around them, and with it their hearts. Where despair had dulled their senses, hope now sharpened them. They noticed every detail, the way sunlight warmed bare rock, the way shadows fell across ridges, the way the horizon shifted from endless white to broken lines of stone and earth. The sound of water grew louder as they descended further. Streams appeared, trickling first, then running in narrow ribbons through the snow. They bent to drink, the icy liquid burning their throats but filling them with new strength. It was more than water. It was the taste of survival. The nights were still cold, bitter, and long, but less cruel than before. They dug shallow hollows in the snow, pressed together for warmth, and whispered to one another of what they had seen: rocks, moss, streams. They spoke of them with the awe of men describing wonders, because in truth they were wonders. Proof that the mountains could be crossed. Proof that life existed beyond the frozen silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the peaks in gold and crimson, they reached a ledge that overlooked a wide valley below. The sight stole their breath. There, winding through the valley, was a river, not a frozen one, but a ribbon of dark blue, alive, cutting through snow and rock. Its banks showed streaks of brown earth, patches of green where grasses clung. It was the first true valley of the world beyond, the first undeniable sign that the Andes did not stretch forever. They stood in silence, staring, their hearts pounding. Some wept openly, their tears freezing on their cheeks but their spirits soaring. For weeks they had lived in a world stripped bare, a desert of white that seemed endless. Now they saw a path. A river meant life. A river meant villages, farms, people. The descent was not finished, but salvation no longer seemed impossible. The following days tested them still. The slope downward was harsh, broken by cliffs and ridges that forced detours. Their bodies, though lifted by hope, were frail. Legs cramped, feet blistered, shoulders ached from carrying packs. Yet hunger was dulled by determination. They allowed themselves small portions, each bite taken in silence, each mouthful a prayer of thanks and a promise to those waiting behind. Hallucinations still came. At times, rocks looked like houses, trees that were not there seemed to wave in the distance. But hope anchored them, and when visions dissolved, they pressed on regardless. The river grew closer. They heard its roar before they stood upon its banks, the water rushing with force, clear and cold, fed by the very peaks they had crossed. They knelt, drank deeply, washed their faces. The sensation of water on skin, after months of snow and ice, felt almost holy. Here the world shifted again. Along the riverbanks, tufts of grass pushed through soil. Tiny flowers, white and yellow, nodded in the breeze. Insects hummed faintly, their sound almost alien after so much silence. The men touched the earth, the grass, the petals, their eyes wide with wonder. It was as if they had stepped from one world into another, from death back into life. The descent did not end here. Villages were still distant, the Andes still vast. But the transformation was complete. They had left behind the white desert, the world of silence and despair. They now walked in a land that promised survival. At night, as they lay beside the river, listening to its rush, they spoke softly of those still waiting in the fuselage. They imagined the joy of returning with news, that there was a way out, that life lay beyond, that rescue was possible. They whispered names, promising to carry them all forward, to not let despair take them. The stars shone above, brilliant as always. But for the first time, the stars no longer seemed cold. They seemed to look down upon men who had crossed death's threshold and found life on the other side. The descent continued, step by step, but each step now carried them closer not only to salvation, but to the end of a story the Andes had tried to write in snow and silence. They had walked through the white desert, and they had endured. Now they walked in the land of rivers and rocks, where hope no longer whispered, but sang. Part 14. Contact. The river had become their companion. After weeks of silence in the white desert, its roar filled the valleys with a music they had nearly forgotten life could make. It rushed with power, cutting through the landscape, a force both beautiful and merciless. The men followed its course, stumbling along its banks, drinking deeply whenever thirst demanded, resting in the shade of boulders when their legs refused to carry them farther. Each bend in the river brought new sights. Trees now clung to the slopes, sparse at first but thickening with every mile. Bushes sprouted along the banks, their leaves trembling in the breeze. The air itself felt different, softer, richer, filled with scents of soil and plants. To men who had lived for months in a world of ice and metal, every detail seemed miraculous. They stopped to touch bark, to hold leaves in trembling fingers, to breathe deeply as though to draw strength directly from the earth. And yet, though the world had changed, hunger still gnawed, exhaustion still weighed. Their bodies were skeletal, their steps unsteady. They had crossed the white desert, but they were not yet safe. The Andes were still vast, and there were no roads, no villages, no people in sight. The river promised life, but it gave no guarantee of rescue. Then, one afternoon, as the sun slid down toward the peaks, they saw movement. Across the river, on a distant slope, figures appeared. At first they thought their eyes were tricking them, another hallucination, another cruel mirage. They rubbed their faces, blinked through tears, stared again. But the figures did not vanish. They moved, slowly, with the sure steps of men accustomed to the land. They carried bundles across their shoulders. They were real. Shepherds. The three climbers froze, their hearts hammering. After so many months in silence, the sight of another human being was overwhelming. They shouted, their voices breaking, calling out across the roar of the river. Their cries echoed in the valley, raw, desperate. The shepherds stopped. They turned their heads, shading their eyes, looking across the rushing water. For a long moment, they did not move, as though unsure whether the figures on the opposite bank were real. Then, slowly, they lifted their hands, waving. The men fell to their knees, sobbing. Tears poured down their hollow cheeks, their shoulders shaking. They shouted again, words tumbling over one another. "Help us! Please!" But the river drowned their cries. The water rushed between them, wide and fast, a barrier they could not cross. Still, they refused to give up. They tore cloth from their packs, waving it frantically. They cupped their hands to their mouths, screaming until their voices cracked. The shepherds gestured back, but the distance was too great, the water too loud. They could not understand. Nando collapsed forward, pressing his forehead into the earth, his body racked with sobs. Roberto gripped his shoulder, whispering hoarsely that they had been seen, that this was enough, that help would come. Antonio raised his arms again, waving until his strength gave out. The shepherds, realizing the desperation of the figures across the river, gestured that they would return. Then they vanished down the slope, their bodies swallowed by trees. The wait that followed was agony. The three men collapsed on the riverbank, their eyes fixed on the place where the shepherds had disappeared. Minutes stretched into hours. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement set their hearts racing. Fear gnawed at them, fear that the shepherds had been a vision, fear that they would not return, fear that hope would slip away once more. But at last, the figures reappeared. One of the shepherds had returned, leading a horse along the opposite bank. He shouted across the water, his words carried faintly over the roar. The survivors strained to hear, catching fragments in Spanish. They shouted back, their voices breaking, their words tumbling incoherently. It became clear that shouting alone would not bridge the river. The shepherd tore a scrap of paper, scrawled words upon it, wrapped it around a stone, and hurled it across the rushing water. The stone landed short, sinking into the torrent. He tried again, throwing harder. This time it landed on the far bank. Nando scrambled forward, seizing the paper with trembling hands. He unfolded it, staring at the words, but his mind was too clouded, his Spanish faltering in the haze of exhaustion. He scrawled back a message of his own, his hand shaking, then wrapped it in fabric and tied it to a small piece of wood. He hurled it across, the note tumbling through the air, landing near the shepherd's feet. The exchange continued, crude but miraculous. At last, the meaning was clear. The shepherds understood. These were survivors of a plane crash. Others were still alive, waiting in the mountains. They needed help. The men collapsed into one another's arms, sobbing. The barrier of the river remained, but it no longer mattered. They had made contact. They had been seen. The silence was broken. As night fell, they watched the shepherds vanish once more, this time heading toward distant villages. The promise of rescue had begun. The men curled together on the riverbank, too weak to celebrate, too overwhelmed to speak. Tears slid silently down their cheeks as they drifted into restless sleep, the rush of the river in their ears, their dreams filled with visions of helicopters, of families, of life restored. The next day dawned with a light unlike any other. The sky was the same, the peaks still towered, the river still roared, but everything felt different. For the first time since the crash, they were no longer invisible. The world knew they lived. They waited on the bank, every sound in the distance making them lift their heads. By afternoon, figures appeared again. More shepherds, carrying bread, carrying food, carrying the first true taste of life in over 2 months. They could not cross the river, but they shouted instructions, gestures of assurance. Rescue teams were on their way. The survivors ate in silence, tears streaming, bread turning to sweetness in their mouths. That night, lying beside the river, they looked at the stars as they always had. But now the stars no longer seemed indifferent. They seemed to shine with promise, with the light of a world that had not abandoned them after all. The Andes had tried to keep them, had buried them in snow and silence, had tested them beyond measure. But the mountains had not won. Contact had been made. Part 15. The Rescue. The river had carried their cries to the world. For so long they had been invisible, a handful of souls lost in the immensity of the Andes, unheard, unseen. Now, for the first time in 72 days, there was proof that their ordeal was not endless. The shepherds had promised to bring help. That promise, thin as the paper note tied to a stone, was enough to lift hearts that had nearly forgotten how to hope. Nando, Roberto, and Antonio remained on the riverbank, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their bellies filled at last with bread carried across in parcels. It was rough bread, coarse and plain, but to them it was a feast. Each bite was chewed slowly, reverently, swallowed with tears. After months of hunger, after weeks of gnawing emptiness, Food once again had taste. It filled not only their stomachs, but their souls. They slept that night beside the water, the sound of rushing current like a lullaby. But it was not the restless half-sleep of so many nights before. This time there was peace. The world had found them. Even if rescue took days, even if danger still lurked in the mountains, they were no longer alone. At dawn they stirred, stiff and weak but carried forward by anticipation. All day they watched the horizon, listening for shouts, for the sound of horses, for any sign that help was near. Hours passed, and doubts flickered. But then, as the sun leaned westward, figures appeared along the riverbank opposite. Villagers, shepherds, men who had come carrying more food, more supplies, and the most precious gift of all, the promise that government rescue parties had been alerted. Helicopters would come. The men wept openly, calling across the water, their words breaking into sobs. The villagers could not cross the swollen river that day, but they shouted assurances. "Hold on. They are coming." For the first time since the crash, the survivors dared to believe the ordeal would end. Back at the fuselage, the men who had remained behind clung to life as best they could. Days had passed since their companions had left on the climb. They had prayed, whispered, stared into the snowfields, wondering if they still lived. Each night had been heavier than the last, each day a test of faith. And then, one afternoon, the silence broke. The sound of helicopters thundered across the valley. At first, the men inside the fuselage thought it was another cruel trick of the wind, another phantom engine echoing across the peaks. They rushed outside, shielding their eyes, their hearts hammering. But this time, it was real. Dark shapes swept across the mountains, blades roaring, snow whipping in clouds beneath them. They screamed, waving frantically, their cries breaking into sobs. After 72 days of silence, the sky had answered. The machines circled, hovered, then descended. The blast of their rotors whipped snow into blizzards, but the survivors did not care. They staggered toward them, arms raised, their emaciated bodies collapsing in relief. Rescuers leapt from the helicopters, their faces stunned at the sight before them. Thin, hollow-cheeked men emerged from the fuselage, clutching one another, eyes streaming with tears. Some could not walk, carried instead on stretchers. Others stumbled forward, falling to their knees in gratitude. The rescuers embraced them, wrapped them in blankets, pressed food and water into trembling hands. Words tumbled out, stories spilling, tears mingling with snow. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted, but for the survivors the moment was quiet, almost dreamlike. They had been found. They were leaving the mountains. The airlift took 2 days. The helicopters could not carry all at once. Some survivors had to wait, hearts pounding as others were flown away, the sound of blades fading into distance. Yet they waited not with despair but with certainty. For once, they knew the machines would return. When at last the final group was lifted away, the valley fell silent once more. The fuselage remained, half buried in snow, a grave for those who had not risen. The survivors looked down as the helicopters carried them over the ridges, over the white desert, over the slopes where they had walked and wept and prayed. The mountains stretched below, vast and indifferent as ever. Yet now they were no longer prison walls. They were part of a story the world would never forget. As the helicopters descended toward the green valleys of Chile, the survivors pressed their faces to the windows, eyes wide. Trees swayed below, rivers sparkled, fields rolled outward in patterns of brown and gold. Villages appeared, then towns. They saw houses, roads, people, civilization, life. Tears flowed freely. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that after months of cold and hunger, the world still existed in such abundance. When the helicopters landed, crowds surged forward: doctors, reporters, soldiers, villagers. Blankets were draped over their shoulders, warm food placed in their hands. Flashbulbs popped, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted. But for the survivors, the noise barely touched them. They were too overwhelmed by the simple feel of solid ground, of hands helping them, of faces filled not with despair but with compassion. And then came the reunions. Mothers ran forward, their cries piercing the air. Fathers embraced sons, siblings clung to one another. Tears fell without restraint. The survivors, thin as shadows, collapsed into the arms of their families, whispering words of love, of apology, of gratitude. For many, it was the first time they truly allowed themselves to believe they had been saved. The world soon learned their story. Newspapers carried headlines of miracle and endurance. Radio spoke of young men who had walked through death and returned. Yet behind the celebration, there was also unease. Questions were asked. Whispers spread. How had they lived so long, in a land where nothing grew, where no animals roamed? The truth of their decision, the unthinkable act of survival, slowly emerged. The survivors did not deny it. They spoke of it with reverence, with sorrow, with honesty. They explained that they had prayed, had wrestled, had begged forgiveness, and had chosen life in the only way the mountains allowed. The world listened in shock, in judgment, in awe. Yet many came to see not sin but courage, not desecration but sacrifice. For the survivors, the opinions of the world mattered less than the bonds they carried within. They knew what they had endured, what choices they had made, what losses they bore. They knew the names of the dead, whispered them each night, carried them as part of their own survival. The mountains had demanded a price. They had paid it, and they would carry its weight forever. When at last the survivors lay in clean beds, under roofs that did not moan with wind, they struggled to sleep. Silence pressed differently here, heavy not with threat but with unfamiliar comfort. They missed, in strange ways, the closeness of bodies pressed together, the shared warmth of desperation. Yet they were grateful beyond words. Food nourished them, blankets warmed them, families surrounded them. And always, in their hearts, were the mountains. The Andes remained, vast and unbroken, their peaks white against the sky. They would always remain, indifferent and eternal. But the survivors had left their mark upon them, not in stone or snow, but in story. The tale of men who had endured the unendurable, who had walked through silence and hunger and despair, and who had emerged alive. The rescue was not only the arrival of helicopters. It was the return of life, the proof that human will could outlast even the most merciless of landscapes. It was the embrace of family, the taste of bread, the sound of voices after months of silence. It was the reminder that even in the coldest places, hope can survive. The Andes had tried to keep them, burying them in snow, starving them, breaking them. Yet the mountains had not prevailed. Against wind and hunger, against avalanche and despair, against silence and death itself, a handful of men had endured. And so their story ended not in the frozen valley, not in the fuselage buried in snow, but in the arms of loved ones, in the embrace of life. The mountains still stood, cold and eternal. But the survivors stood too, fragile, thin, scarred, but unbroken. They had been rescued, and the world would never forget. And so, the story of the Andes plane crash comes to its quiet end. 72 days in the mountains tested every limit of the human spirit. Against the cold, against hunger, against despair, the survivors endured. And when at last the helicopters came, it was not only their bodies that were carried out of the valley, but their story, a story that has lived ever since as a testament to courage, resilience, and the will to live. As you return from this journey, take a moment to reflect on what it means to endure hardship, to find strength in one another, and to carry hope even when the world feels silent. If you found peace or meaning in this story, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of what keeps these histories alive, and your support helps us bring more of them to you. For now, rest easy. Let the echoes of the mountains fade into quiet. May you find calm, comfort, and perhaps a deeper sense of gratitude as you drift towards sleep. Good night.